I'm Bruce Carruthers. I'm the director of the Buffett Institute for Global Studies, and it's my pleasure to MC this final panel that's entitled Realizing the Human and Economic Benefits of Improved Energy Access. So we've talked a lot about energy access, about what works, and now we're going to learn some more about what people will do with the energy they now have access to, or what they might do, or what doesn't happen. So we're going to go in a slightly different order than listed in the program. We're going to start with Fiona Burlig, who is a postdoc at the University of Chicago, an economist. Then we're going to go to Kelly Carlin, who's a senior associate at the Rocky Mountain Institute. And finally, we're going to close with Sera Young, who's an assistant professor of anthropology here at Northwestern. So I'll ask Fiona, please, to kick off our panel.
Okay, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I have to sort of forewarn you that both as an economist and as someone from the University of Chicago, this is going to be a slightly downer talk relative to what we've had so far. That's fulfilling my stereotype for the day, but hopefully there's some sort of interesting insights in here. So I'm going to be sort of presenting a little bit of an overview of how economists in the past couple of years have started to think about questions related to rural electrification and go through some really new, exciting results. So to sort of motivate this, I'm sure we don't need more motivation here, but we have the stylized fact that in wealthy countries, there's more electricity consumed per capita in a very nice sort of log-log relationship. And so the central question here from an economist perspective is this a causal relationship? Is it that having access to more energy drives growth? Or is it that having access to growth sort of drives energy consumptions? A bit of both, somewhere in between these two things. They're totally unrelated, who knows, right? So we want to actually ask whether rural electrification is causally associated with increases in economic development. And so I'm going to talk through a couple of different papers that have tried to address this question in a variety of different settings. So the first one came out in Science Advances this past year and is thinking about installing solar microgrids, and in particular, what they're going to do is a randomized controlled trial. So you can think about that as sort of a medical experiment, drug type of trial, where you take a sample of villages, and in half of them, you're going to randomly assign them to a treatment group. They get access to the subsidized solar microgrid. And in the other half, you're going to assign them to the control group. They have to wait until the research is done to then get access to the mini-grids if they want them later. And what that allows us to do is estimate the causal effect of providing mini-grids to these villages, the idea being that the two groups look otherwise similar in the absence of the treatment. And so then doing this kind of randomization is going to actually allow us to sort of answer this causal question. So this first paper that's going to take this type of approach is looking at 101 habitations. You can think of that as sort of sub-village neighborhoods in very rural Uttar Pradesh in India. They're going to be studying the effects of these mini-grids about a year after electrification happens. And I'm going to highlight this timing throughout the talk just because I think when we're looking at the economic impacts of grid-scale electrification or of microgrid-based electrification, thinking about the timing that we're measuring these outcomes at is really important. And like I mentioned, they're going to be measuring solar mini-grids. So when they come in and randomly install solar mini-grids in half of these villages, what do they end up finding? They're going to see that, yes, these solar mini-grids do lead to a large increase in the number of households that actually have access to electricity, on the order of 30 to 35 percentage points. And they also find that a lot of these households were using their existing, or the way that they're substituting electricity for previous consumption is by reducing their kerosene use. So they are switching their indoor lighting from kerosene to being sort of light bulbs that they're plugging into these mini-grids. And so that's an interesting result. We do find some substitution between the old technology and the new electricity using technology. But at the same time, they measure a bunch of other things that development economists might care about. Things like savings, spending, number of businesses that are opening, time spent either at home at working or studying for the kids. And they're actually finding sort of precisely estimated null results. They're not finding sort of large-scale economic transformation, although they do argue that maybe these households are somewhat better off in that they've sort of spent less on kerosene and their electricity bill is sort of cheaper than they were. So they have a little bit more money in their pocket. But they're not finding these sort of massive transformative effects. So now let's move to another set of microgrids in India. So this is ongoing research right now that's in the field in Bihar. They're again doing a randomized trial where they're subsidizing the introduction of mini-grids. And the thing that's really interesting in this context is they're going to be thinking about what happens to mini-grid take-up when you have other substitutes available in the area. So in particular, they went into a bunch of villages and randomly offered some of them these solar mini-grids. But they found that only 20% of the households actually signed up for participation with the mini-grids, even after providing heavy subsidy levels. And they found especially that this demand was particularly low in places where the grid was coming in. So then they inquired a little bit further to figure out why is demand for this kind of stuff so low, even with pretty low prices. And one of the responses they got pretty regularly was, well, we actually already have something here that provides us with a lot of power. So it turns out in these rural villages in India, there have been a series of diesel genset operators that have come in and formed their own sort of hack pirate mini-grids, if you want, that are sort of already running. And so when you get a new fancy shiny solar-powered mini-grid, there's not a ton of incentive for these villagers to shift between the old diesel grid, which works pretty well, and the solar grid, which is expensive and new technology that they don't fully understand. And furthermore, the Indian government, as was mentioned earlier, has been going on a massive push of grid extension. And so if you know that you're going to get grid scale access 2 years from now, maybe it doesn't make that much sense to invest in a huge mini-grid system at the moment. Shifting gears now to Kenya, we're going to start thinking about grid-scale electrification. So this is a new NBER working paper by my PhD advisor and a couple of co-authors, thinking about villages in Western Kenya. And again, what these guys are doing is randomly coming into some villages and offering them, in this case, subsidies for household connections to the grid. So in Kenya, in this context, a household connection costs about $400. That's very expensive. And so what these researchers did was, in different villages, offer different subsidy levels. So some people paid nothing for their connection, some people paid $100, some people paid $200, et cetera. And so they're able to then look at, first of all, what is the sort of willingness to pay for a connection to the grid at different subsidy levels. And then secondly, how does that actually compare to the costs of providing the grid services from the utility? And so what they end up doing is something that looks like this. So this was one of the very first electricity poles that was installed in one of these villages. And so you can sort of see them putting up the poles and connecting the household. Apparently, one of the people in this village was so excited that they got their grid connection that she showed up and gave my advisor a chicken. So there's like a really awkward picture of her holding a chicken that I unfortunately don't have in the presentation. But they do have some evidence, right, that these grid connections are actually happening. They were working with Kenya Power, the utility, to make that happen. But when they then look at the effects, what they find is that it costs around $55,000 to electrify a full village. But if you add up sort of villagers' demand estimated through these randomized subsidies, total demand for these connections was only around $12,000. So there's a big cost gap between what it actually costs to provide electricity in those locations and what villagers are willing to pay. At the same time, you might be worried that, okay, well, maybe you're finding low effects or low willingness to pay because people don't have access to credit or other things. So then the other thing that they go and do is actually look at outcomes in these households that got the subsidized connection. So if you got a free connection, what are you actually doing with your power? And there again, they're finding these really precisely estimated zero effects on basically everything other than a little bit of money spent on electrification and maybe small increases in a sort of quality of life index. But they don't find effects on things like employment, business generation, time spent studying, test scores, other types of outcomes that we think might be indicative of electricity starting to transform the population. So again, to put that together, it's very expensive to bring the grid to these places. This is again the sort of the full grid, not a mini grid, but it's expensive to bring the grid to these places. Demand at current prices is very low, and we don't see big transformative effects that might suggest subsidizing at the same time. Finally, I'm going to talk about a little bit of my own research because I get to. So we're looking in 20,000 villages in India. We're studying the Indian National Rural Electrification Program that took place during the 2000s. What we're going to do is a slightly different twist on the randomized trial, but you can think about it the same way. Essentially, the program has a rule where all villages above a certain size were eligible for electrification. All villages slightly below that size weren't, so we can compare the village that's just above to the village that's just below in a similar style to the randomized controlled trial. We're now looking between 3 and 5 years after the energy infrastructure was put in, and this program is studying what happens when you bring in sort of large-scale village energy infrastructure that's meant to stimulate the economy. This is a picture of brightness at night in the villages that are eligible compared to the ineligible villages. So the guys to the left here were not eligible for electrification. The guys to the right were. This is before the program happens. After the program happens, you see a sharp jump at that 300 mark. That's us seeing in the nightlights from space that these villages are getting brighter when the program is coming in. So that's exciting. The program is working, connecting households, and increasing energy access. However, when we then go and measure a variety of different outcome variables, things like employment, TV ownership, kerosene lighting, quality of the house, poverty rates, income, school enrollment, we're seeing, again, very precisely estimated null results across a wide variety of these outcomes. And this is in a much larger sample than some of the randomized controlled trials. And so if we sort of put all of these results together, this new evidence from these sort of well-done research designs seems to be suggesting that maybe rural electrification isn't dramatically transforming the economy like we might have otherwise thought. But a couple of maybe caveats or interesting sort of things to point out there. It's still challenging to measure welfare effects. So the things that I just mentioned, things like employment, schooling, that kind of stuff, doesn't fully capture what an economist would think of as big W or sort of overall happiness. And measuring that kind of stuff in an economic survey is really challenging, and we need to do more work to be able to quantitatively measure those types of things to decide whether or not rural electrification is actually worth it. Secondly, grid extension is a very expensive proposition, which sort of lends itself to thinking about microgrids and other cheaper solutions. If the demand isn't really there at current prices, can we bring prices down so that we can actually electrify in a cost-effective manner? Do microgrids actually form good substitutes for grid-scale electrification, or is it really the case that in many places demand is going to be low, particularly for the microgrids because of anticipation of the grid coming in shortly? And then finally, so I think this was mentioned this morning as well, but it seems like we spent a lot of policy time thinking about rural electrification, but I think there's actually some really interesting questions about how do we sort of improve urban energy use and access, and maybe microgrids are a way to sort of help bolster reliability in urban contexts where we can really get a lot of marginal bang for our marginal buck, if you want. All right, thanks so much.
So now we have Kelly Carlin.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay? So my name is Kelly Carlin. I'm a senior associate with Rocky Mountain Institute. We are a nonprofit energy think tank and consulting firm. Been around for about 35 years. We were founded by an energy efficiency scientist named Amory Lovins. For the past 3-4 years now, we've been working on African energy issues, focusing on sub-Saharan Africa. I oversee our off-grid work stream, so dealing with mini-grids and solar home systems. That means two things. One is working with African governments and utilities on their energy planning in partnership with the donor community, private sector, investors, and then also doing kind of cross-cutting white paper work. So my perspective is, as with Fiona's economist angle, ours is we're looking for how to scale the technology that we've been looking at today. So from a business perspective, maybe this is a little bit more hopeful than the economist, but from a business perspective, if the need is to reach 1 billion people with energy access, and we believe that off-grid is a big part of that or could be a big part of that, how on earth do you scale that financially and from a business perspective? So that's kind of the angle that I'm coming at it from. And I think it's a challenge. So achieving commercial viability, and I apologize for the mini-grid language. That's what we say on our team. So how to scale mini-grids to commercial viability in Africa. And the first thing I want to talk about is the context. So Fiona mentioned this as well. Mini-grid costs exist in a context of energy alternatives. They're substitutes that customers in most markets are looking at. The status quo certainly for a lot of commercial and industrial or small business customers is no energy access, it's a diesel generator. That looks different across all of sub-Saharan Africa, but in many places it ranges roughly as an all-in LCOE between 55 cents and 95 cents. So the diesel gen said 35 cents to 60 cents. Mini-grids need to compete against that. Mini-grid companies, for good reason, in Africa are really wary about sharing any costing data. They're really young companies. It's a young market. It's a hard market to succeed in. They don't want to tell you what their LCOE is. They don't want to tell you what their installed costs are. Our modeling and our interviews suggest that the best companies in Africa right now are maybe doing 80 cents on an LCOE basis, which makes it really hard to compete with a diesel gen set. Those costs are coming down. There's a lot more that could bring them further down, which is what I'll talk about. But being competitive with the alternatives is really important, and it has to be considered alongside grid extension as well. So from an energy planning perspective for utilities, for governments in Africa, mini-grids need to be considered as part of a master rural electrification plan that looks at where grid extension makes sense, where it's going to pay back, and where off-grid, whether that's mini-grids or solar home systems, are a better choice. On the right there, just the one bullet point I want to point out, there's been something around $400 million spent on trying to prove the viability of mini-grids in Africa and South Asia, and there's very little market growth to show for it. So why, with all this expense, are there only a couple hundred solar hybrid mini-grids in sub-Saharan Africa? We believe at RMI that there are 4 categories of barriers to profitable and scalable mini-grid business models. One, cost is simply high. That includes everything from the hardware costs up front. The ongoing cost, the O&M, is quite expensive. It can be really hard to do logistics in remote places. The policy and finance has a direct impact on cost. Number 2, the capacity utilization is poor. I think a couple folks have kind of referenced this as well today, but if solar is the cheapest resource, you want to have really good capacity utilization during the day when your generation, when that asset is cheapest. You do not want to burn diesel fuel, and you don't want to have to oversize your battery. So capacity utilization typically is very poor on mini-grids in sub-Saharan Africa. Third, the financing is expensive or unavailable. Typically costs in Africa range between 15% and 20% for debt, which is prohibitive. It just doesn't, there is no debt being used for mini-grids in any kind of sustainable way in Africa. And the fourth is that policy is either unpredictable or unsupportive. So there are countries like Nigeria where the right regulations are in place, but no one trusts the regulations. They haven't been implemented in a way that anyone trusts. Or in places like Kenya, where the wrong rules are in the books, but companies are able to succeed because no one's enforcing the rules. And in that environment, it's not realistic to expect equity and debt to come in and help scale the market. Here's just a sample LCOE stack. This is a 200 kilowatt peak mini grid, so in that sense, extremely unusual in Africa, but we've seen potential sites like this in Nigeria, and we've seen operating sites about half this size. But the reason why it's a 200 kilowatt peak, and this is, like I said, really big for Africa, it's at this size that the fixed costs get spread out and mini grids start to look better. So a lot of the mini grids, I think Jay was showing mini grids that typically in Kenya, a lot of the commercial ones are under 10 kilowatts. And so under 10 kilowatts, your fixed costs become a huge part of the LCOE. It drives up the LCOE and makes it less competitive. But it's an ability to pay question. So you can target places where they exist, and it's debatable how many of them exist. But in Nigeria, we've seen dozens of sites that are over 100 kilowatt peak. And in that case, the LCOE starts to look better. But you can see some of these big drivers here, battery, fuel, the overhead and the O&M, project development, things like that. And I'll just make a quick note that there is diesel cost on here, and I think it's something that can get overlooked when we're looking across the Atlantic at Africa and how they're powering things. But if you eliminate diesel from mini grid systems in an environment where when the cost of capital is over 15%, it pushes the LCOE way, way up. So it'd be wonderful if the whole world was using lithium-ion batteries, there was no diesel whatsoever, but in a high cost of capital environment, it's not a realistic way to make an affordable product right now. So I'm just going to focus in on one of those pieces, one of those barriers, and that's poor capacity utilization. So this is data from some work that we've done in Uganda. The effect there of declining cost of energy from left to right with the introduction of daytime loads that are able to take advantage of that cheap solar. And you can see on the right there that the initial curve is the one, that lowest line, and this is typical all across Africa in most communities where the peak is in the evening between 5 p.m. and midnight, and that's a peak that you can't serve very well with solar, so you're relying on battery or diesel. It's expensive. So we're trying to think about ways that we could stimulate demand. You can introduce productive uses that are going to have a daytime peak. And the result of doing that, lowers the LCOE, and it helps generate revenue. And this is based on our modeling, and site visits. This is not something that's being done at any commercial scale on mini-grids in Africa right now. So what can be done? How can the cost be lowered? This is something that our team has been looking closely at. And we believe that across the whole value chain, there are places to squeeze the LCOE, and that it's possible that in the next 2 years, the cost could be reduced from 60 cents to around 20 cents. And just one more, I guess, piece on that managing load bit again. And this again shows that what daytime stimulation can do, and the kind of loads that could fill that daytime productive use. Potentially, from interviewing communities and looking at current uses, it could be in fishing communities, cooling or ice production. It could be solar irrigation done in a way that's deliberately using just that solar daytime power. But this is something that could help reduce the LCOE by as much as 15%. So that's just the demand stimulation is just like a little piece of how we see the cost being reduced. And that's what I got. So I'll pass it on to the next presenter.
Thank you, Kelly. And now, finally, Sera Young.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for sticking with us through the day. I can assure you that drinks are just around the corner. So I'm Sera Young. I'm in the anthropology department here at Northwestern. And I understand that today's session has been all about energy. And as you look at the slide here, you'll see pictures of water from my fieldwork and food, human, personal, from my fieldwork. And you might be thinking, you might be scratching your head, let's just say that. And then when I tell you that I'm an anthropologist, Do I need to redo? Are we good? I got the thumbs up from the cameraman. When I tell you I'm an anthropologist and a public health nutritionist who focuses on what's called the first 1,000 days, so that's the year prior to delivery and the 2 years postpartum, you might be really scratching your head and saying, what is this woman talking to us for? Let us have the drinks. But, in fact, within this period of 1,000 days, I focus on food and water insecurity. And I do this focusing mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. And Eric and Mar thought that it would be useful for me to talk about my experiences with measuring food and water insecurity and draw some analogies between that and energy use or energy insecurity. So that's what I'm here to do. And I want to talk about how we conceptualize how insecurities impact both women and children. And you can easily extrapolate to other adult populations. But the way we think about this is that insecurities work through 4 pathways. So there's the economic pathway, there's the nutrition pathway, the disease pathway, and the psychosocial pathway. And all of these pathways both impact the mother and the infant directly, but also the infant through the mother. This is very heuristic. It's actually more complicated and bidirectional, but you sort of get the gist with this. So I have 3 goals for today. And they're quick ones. The first is to talk to you a little bit about what our ability to measure experiences of household food insecurity have done for us. And it's revealed a lot. And then I'm moving to sort of what we know a little less about, which is water insecurity. And I'm going to talk to you about how my research on food insecurity led to developing an instrument to measure water insecurity, and what we're learning about that. And then sort of the least well understood domain is energy insecurity. And I'm going to talk to you about what measuring household energy insecurity could tell us. And there's even someone sitting in this very room who could do it very well. So just to make sure we all we're speaking the same language, food insecurity is a term that's thrown around in a lot of ways, used by a lot of people. And food insecurity is not starvation in the same way that water insecurity isn't absolute drought. Food insecurity is just uncertain or sort of unsatisfactory types, quantities, diversity of food. And we know how to measure food insecurity quite well. There are several scales developed by USAID, the Gallup World Polls with a few questions, in this case 9 questions. We asked Bruce, how often in the last month have you worried about having enough to eat, skipped meals, went for a day or a night without eating? And then the answers to those questions can just be summed and someone can be given a food insecurity score. So we know food insecurity isn't good, but we don't know how, well, we didn't know how food insecurity impacted those first 1,000 days. So what me and my team have done is to implement this food insecurity scale in the context of several large pregnancy cohorts in East Africa. And we found that, indeed, food insecurity isn't good, but we're finding kind of pretty surprising ways in which food insecurity wasn't good. So unsurprising is food insecurity isn't good for BMI, so women who are food insecure are thinner, but then what we found is it had a bunch of impacts for infant feeding. Disease pathways, this is probably the most surprising. So what we found is that being food insecure was the strongest predictor of HIV viral breakthrough. So it means that women who were HIV infected and were virally suppressed, those women who were food insecure were the least likely to have virus in their blood again. And in the psychosocial pathway, we found that depression and stress were strongly associated with food insecurity, because I mean, who can imagine something more stressful than not having enough food for your children? So moving to water, as an anthropologist, we do lots of formative work. So we did something called a photo elicitation interview. What that means is I give you a camera and I say, take pictures of things that, and in this case, impact how you feed your kids. And what we got were a bunch of pictures like this, which is water. These are sources of water that people used for cooking, cleaning, growing crops. And what I heard again and again is that problems with water were what were impacting the ability, for example, to breastfeed. And so I was ready to measure it with this beautifully developed NIH-funded cohort, except that the available measures of water insecurity weren't precise enough. So, you know, there are lots of ways of measuring water, and many of you in the room can do these measurements of water, but when it came down to the level of the household, there was no analogous measurement for water insecurity. So we have begun, and in fact we've finished, developing a scale to measure water insecurity at the level of the household. It's validated for Kenya. So we know how to measure this woman's water insecurity, but water insecurity doesn't happen only in Kenya. Oh, well, and we found that there's lots of impacts of water insecurity, really surprising ones that I didn't see coming. So water insecurity, queuing for water, you saw that woman waiting in the queue, that's 2 hours a day for some families. That takes away from time for going to school, taking care of the household, working, selling vegetables at the market. The nutrition pathway, we saw kids were really going without a lot of variety of food because women were saying, I have to choose between buying food and buying clean water. In the psychosocial pathway, we saw again that water insecurity was very stressful, and women were more likely to be depressed, but we also saw a lot of violence in the families. So it's a pretty good reason to beat your wife if there wasn't enough water in the household. I didn't see that coming. So we know how to measure water insecurity in Kenya. Water insecurity doesn't only happen in Kenya, and so right now I'm heading up a study. We're collecting data in 27 sites around the world and we'll do this statistical magic to come up with the 8 or 9 or 10 questions that are analogous to the food insecurity scale. So we can really hone in on these questions. But you're not here to hear about food or water insecurity, you're here to hear about energy insecurity. Or security. And what I want to talk to you about is how energy insecurity could be shaping maternal and child health. So how all of the efforts that you're going to make these microgrids happen could really be impacting families in positive ways. I can imagine it's very plausible that these income generation activities could be impacted. If women aren't going far to collect firewood, they have more time to be selling stuff at the market. It takes a lot of fuel to cook certain nutrient-dense foods like beans. Beans take longer to cook than rice. Beans are healthier for you. Just the ability to cook food, to use fuel more efficiently would be, I imagine, quite beneficial. Respiratory infection is very common among people who cook in indoor fires. It's usually women who do that. Anemic women are at greater risk for all kinds of consequences of this indoor cooking. So I liked, Fiona, your presentation, and thinking about, are we measuring the right outcomes for impacts of energy insecurity? I think we need to be thinking a little more broadly, a little more along these lines. And then the mental health, like the stress and depression, I can imagine also would be deeply impacted by increased energy availability. But like with food, like with water, we don't have the right tool to measure energy insecurity at this very fine level. So there are some examples of metrics to measure these things, but at this level, we don't have the tool that we need to do this and to see how, if these interventions are impacting energy insecurity. Fortunately, my postdoc, the only Ghanaian in the crowd as far as I can tell, is really taken up with energy insecurity as his sort of next step, and he's taking the first steps towards developing a scale to measure energy insecurity. So I suggest you corner him during drinks and talk to him about it. I'll close by just telling you, kind of outlining 5 things that such a scale could tell us. And the first is how energy insecurity, how these interventions impact well-being. Like, those are plausible pathways that I talked about, but we're not certain that will be the impact, or if those would even be the impacts. It'll tell us who are the most vulnerable individuals to energy insecurity, because as we saw with food and energy, some members of households are buffered from these shocks more so than others. Where to target the resources. When we decide where grids should be built, or where wells should be built, or where nutritional intervention should happen, we should target them to those who need it for potential to benefit. And we would want to know if our fancy new shiny technology impacts the thing that we think it will. I mean, I can tell you there's a lot of examples of people trying to improve food insecurity where the impact isn't there as expected. And then lastly, you can say, is this cost effective now, or will it possibly become cost effective in the future? So the goals were to talk about household food insecurity. Now you know what food insecurity is, and you can see these far-ranging impacts in the first 1,000 days. Telling you that a scale is possible to be developed. At least I think it is. We're almost there. We should finish in the next couple months, and we'll be able to measure water insecurity. And I would posit that measuring household energy insecurity is really the next frontier in understanding the interface between engineering endeavors and global or public health impacts. So that, I acknowledge all the people who did all the work, all the funders, and I'll leave you to it. Thank you.
So I'm officially the moderator, and I'm going to try to be slightly immoderate because it's at the very end of the day. And the kind of premise of the whole conference has been that microgrids offer a different way to grant access to power that has some highly desirable features. We heard a lot about microgrids in high-income countries, and really the premise of thinking about how to bring microgrids or electrification or access to power to low-income countries is that this will do some good. And this is where the dismal science person to my immediate left, managed to do her job, living up to the reputation of the University of Chicago and economics at the same time, and really kind of say, well, maybe at least for some set of measures, it seems that the news isn't quite as good. So what I'd like to do is to go down the panel and press you again, really on the issue of what do you conceive to be the top 3 or 2, or maybe there's only one beneficial impacts of improved energy access for people in low-income countries. And because we know, partly from what Sera just told us, it seems very plausible to imagine that having access to energy, given the role of energy in providing all kinds of other things, it would mean greater access to water, perhaps, or there would be local access to emergency services that survive a power outage, or that it would affect food prep and preservation, or it would undergird communications and connections via cell phones, or it would raise somebody's quality of life because now they can watch TV and know what everyone else is talking about. So it's very easy to imagine a set of impacts. It also could be the case that maybe thinking about the beneficial outcomes is the wrong framing for this. Maybe we want to imagine that people just have a right to power. That this is, as a citizen, you should have, you should have electrical power just like everyone else does who lives in the city, and therefore it's not really a matter of it having good consequences. It's that, well, you'll sort out what to do with the power yourself. And we did have in the panels of the morning some quite telling episodes from high-income countries about the virtues of microgrids. Particularly, it meant, if you were NYU, it meant that you had light and power when the rest of New York City was in darkness, or that you had uncovered a greener energy source, and that itself was a good thing. When we go to low-income countries, some of those outcomes don't really matter as much, because maybe people in low-income countries aren't so concerned about sustainability or green energy. They just want energy. So anyway, I would just like to go down the table and to have you, give me the most hopeful, best case scenario. Why? What will improved energy access do for people in low-income countries? What's your best guess? What's the best case we could make? And I'll start with the dismal science economist to give us the bummer answer first, and then we can hopefully go to happier outcomes.
I'll put my happy hat on for a minute. So I do think there's a couple of ways in which improved energy access in low-income countries can lead to dramatic impacts on human welfare. So I think one that we've talked about a few times today is reduced indoor air pollution. Switching from cooking on coal or kerosene stoves to something that's electric can have dramatic impacts on indoor air pollution exposure, especially for poor women, which then, as we've just heard, has also potential impacts on child outcomes and later life outcomes as well. And I think we're starting to see some evidence from some of these good randomized trials that, in fact, household electrification can lead to reductions in indoor air pollution if the communities that get access to electricity in this way also have funding or credit or these other sort of ways of accessing appliances that actually allow them to substitute between technologies. So I think the air pollution to health pathway is one that's really important. I think a second one is, as much as I like to put all of my quantitative outcomes up there, human well-being as measured by, are you enjoying your life more? Is your quality of life better? That can come from access to TV, that can come from cell phones, that can come from Facebook, maybe not these days, but that type of technology is potentially really welfare improving. And so just because it doesn't lead to you doubling your manufacturing output doesn't mean that electrification can't improve human well-being. And I think it is important to try and think about measuring some of these more qualitative sort of measures of human well-being. And the last thing I'll say is, I sort of mentioned this earlier, but I do think there's a lot more work that we need to do on urban energy access. And I think that one of the ways in which energy can really be used to stimulate growth in a developing country context is to spur manufacturing and thinking about reducing blackouts for improving sort of large-scale growth, because one way to bring people out of poverty is to grow the economy. And so if we can target energy access to the places that could really benefit from that, maybe that is sending a lot of power to big cities where we can really grow companies and have jobs and lead to increased manufacturing output. That by itself could also lead to economic transformation. And so I would sort of urge us to continue to think rural communities are important, but we spend a lot of time thinking about this, and I think there's an increased need for focus on the urban energy access problem, because I think that's where a lot of welfare benefits are sort of still to be realized.
Sera.
So my short answer is women's time and safety. So women spend a lot of time either getting the money to buy the fuel or going to get the fuel, like going out into the bush to collect fuel. That's dangerous. There's lots of ways that it's dangerous for wild animals and wild men. And a women's time for cooking. So using sort of wood fires can take longer to cook than propane, for example. I'm not allowed to say that at a microgrid thing. But there's there's a lot of ways that energy insecurity impacts women's time use that I would say that's really important. I would also say, to answer that question better, we need to understand how energy is currently used, though. I mean, it really depends if there's a lot of electricity around or if everyone's quite comfortable with kerosene already. I mean, we need to know what people's energy uses and needs are before we try to save the day with whatever the most recent technology is.
The two I'd add to that, the first one is productive use. I think and this is optimistic, but in the right situations where energy efficient soft start appliances are available to do the activity that's already being done at a lower cost than diesel gensets and with greater reliability, I think absolutely there's a huge benefit there, and that's something that I feel like I've seen the beginning of in some countries in Africa, and I think that's a real benefit. The second one, and one that I think is maybe less obvious, and it's not something that was really on my radar a couple of years ago, but I think that a huge benefit is helping, from my perspective, African countries, but it could be South Asian countries, helping them achieve crucial national priorities like security and, from their perspective, growth. So like in Nigeria, a huge source of instability is Boko Haram in the north. The worst energy insecurity, the worst energy access situation is in the north. It's not a coincidence, and it's like a vicious cycle that feeds on itself. And in the same country, in Nigeria, in Lagos, looking at urban, peri-urban areas that drive economic growth but have the potential to do way, way more. We've toured some neighborhoods in Lagos that are, one is a neighborhood called Shamalu. It's all printers, and it's like some kind of like Dickensian scene of industrial printers just lining the streets. And the power runs for about an hour or two a day. So 1 or 2 hours a day in a 24-hour period. You can hear it go on because all the generators turn off. And then the moment that the grid goes off or the disco stops providing power, you know it because thousands of generators turn on at once. And to look at that and say, okay, this is the cost and it could be done cheaper. And that's a real priority for the government. That's a real priority for the people. I think that's a clear benefit in my mind.
I'm going to ask one other question and then open things to the audience. So this was the best case scenario. Are there any potential social or economic downsides to increased energy access? Is there anything that could go wrong that you imagine? And I want to set aside Fiona's non-outcomes. Those are good things that didn't happen. Are there some bad things that we should worry about, or is this only a potential upside story? Fiona?
Yes, I think there's two potential big downsides. One of them is, I'm going to cheat and sort of bring in my non-outcomes, which is that when we're thinking about, as a budget-constrained policymaker, like it would be all well and good to be able to spend infinite money on energy access, infinite money on roads, infinite money on schools, health facilities, clean water, et cetera. We're not in that world, right? We're in a world where a policymaker has to decide between different interventions. And what we'd really like to do is be getting as much human welfare benefit for our dollar. And so I think one potential challenge is if we funnel a lot of money into energy, but really the big benefits to be had are in new health clinics or education facilities, then that's opportunities that we've missed out on by spending this money in sort of the wrong place. And so I think that's one concern. And I think the other one, though, is as demand continues to grow, thinking about how to fuel that demand without turning entirely to coal, both for local air pollution and sort of global CO2 consequences. So figuring out ways to bring the renewable prices down, to make these investments profitable, so that we can sort of continue to spur growth with this energy use, but also sort of provide a sustainable environmental situation for ourselves and our kids.
Sera?
I'm actually not sure. I worry a lot about giving people things that they don't want, and so I would rather just ask people, like, what are your 3 biggest needs here and now before we give you a bunch of vitamins or give you a bunch of breastfeeding education or do a microgrid?
It's a good question. I think there are 3 that come to mind. One is if the owner is not someone who paid for it or voted for it. And I'd say that's the vast majority of energy access initiatives in sub-Saharan Africa right now, are cases where no one paid for it, or they didn't pay a real price for it, or it wasn't paid for by their government, or they didn't vote for it to happen. And when there's no ownership, it's a waste of donor resources, it's a waste of local resources, it's a waste of time. It is an entirely commonplace sight to see in Africa, and I'm sure plenty of people here have seen it, where you find a clinic in the middle of nowhere. You're like 6 hours from the nearest city, and there'll be like a solar graveyard on the clinic. And that's tragic that money was spent in the first place, that it was spent with good intentions, and the clinic doesn't have power. So ownership is key. I think the energy itself is great, and the access is fantastic. It's the stuff that comes with it. So if you install it and there's no infrastructure, or the cost is high, and they're going to eventually have to bear that, that's a downside. That's a real cost. I think on-grid in Africa, there's a lot of hemorrhaging of cash right now. There are not cost-reflective tariffs. If you replicate that with a donor model that's subsidized, you risk the same consequences of hemorrhaging cash. And the third potential downside is exposing developing nations to the whims of donor partners. And I mean, no need to point at our own country right now, but like Brexit happened, DFID's priorities changed entirely. They started shifting money around. Energy projects that were 4 years in the making suddenly stopped. And it's hard enough for a country like Sierra Leone to kind of focus its own politics without being buffeted around by donor partner, donor country politics. And that's a downside. None of that's the actual energy, but all the stuff that makes it happen and sticks around after it arrives.
So I have some more questions, but I think it would be more interesting to open things up to the audience. So I assume we got the mics already, and so if you have any questions, now's the time. Yes, over here.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all three speakers on the panel. It was such an interesting discussion, and I learned a lot. I suppose my question is for the dismal scientist, which is a great label. So I missed the details of the study where you showed very few kind of socioeconomic impacts from the electrification. My question is, what was the time period over which those impacts were? Because I mean, you do see many studies which, measure all these outcomes of electrification on different measures of welfare, and they find, they go back a year later or 2 years later, and they find very little impact. But I mean, the question is, I suppose, highlighting that electricity access is a barrier to development, but it's not a panacea. And if you can imagine, any developed country developing without modern energy, then it would be impossible. And whether we should be kind of more looking at it as a necessary but not sufficient condition, rather than kind of a treatment and then effect sort of thing. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. So 3 of the 4 studies were looking. Yes, can you hear me? Yeah. 3 of the 4 studies were looking 1 year out. So I agree that's a question. Long-term follow-up is still an important piece. My own research is between 3 and 5 years out. Is that 20 years? No, but is that 1 year? Also no. And I think, again, it's important to keep in mind what we're trading off when we're subsidizing this energy access. We have a lot of evidence that things like roads and cell phone access really provide economic benefits now. So thinking about a discount rate, we need to factor that in, and sort of the timing it takes to actually develop these benefits is an important piece of the cost-benefit calculation. I think the other thing I would say is, I think these results sort of highlight the importance of, it's not just bringing benefits up, but it's bringing costs down as well, right? So part of the thing that makes rural electrification, especially on the grid, so expensive is you're really extending lots of transmission and distribution infrastructure really far and into places with really bad road infrastructure. And so one thing that sort of comes to mind is if we can help encourage a little bit more urbanization, and then we're not bringing public goods nearly as far. I think this idea of necessary but not sufficient is exactly right. So I don't think anything that I've showed you says that electrification is not necessary for development. I don't think we have the evidence on that, but I also think that what we have found so far suggests that you can't just bring power and then walk away. There need to be other things. And so I think the ongoing research is sort of about what are those other things and how can we sort of bring this power access in a way that enables people to actually take advantage of it.
Over here.
So my question is about just what I observe here in the United States, that new technologies are adopted by young people and they really become very fluent in them, whereas some of us older people don't get used to them as much. So I'm wondering if the way to approach this would be to focus on the young and schools and education first and teach them about power utilization, how it could help their homes, et cetera, and have that focus, or also, along with that, if it's really a multi-generational type of training thing, then we can't really measure it till we get to the next generation. But just those two things, do either one of those things make sense?
So in fact, I've seen in some curricula in like sort of secondary school students are learning solar power stuff in school. And there's lots of small solar panel sort of endeavors in and around like CIA where you are. Obama's grandma's there. Busia, like these are places where it is the like students who are learning at school how to fix the solar panel. And that's, I would agree that that's a promising way to get these things to happen.
I'll add on that. I mean, you raise a good question. Fortunately, Africa is the youngest continent in the world. People are really young, like it's a young population. I think education awareness are really key. It's a big part of it. I think there are a lot of different things to look at with the solar home systems and their growth in East Africa, but one thing that's definitely positive that you can take out of it is the education and awareness that needs to go into their expansion. So when they move into a new market, they're working with people who, in some cases, have never had a bank account, or they've never used an M-Pesa account until they buy a solar home system. There's no credit worthiness for the customer. They don't know how solar works, and so all of that has to be part of it. And I think there are more creative ways to incorporate that kind of learning and incorporate solar home systems into the way microgrids are expanding in the African market. So if you have customers who now have credit worthiness proven, they understand how solar works, they have an account, a bank account, like all those things make it that much easier for a mini grid to move in or a microgrid to move in and set up a successful business. But I think those are good points.
Yes, here.
Hi, this is mostly for Fiona, but everybody, jump in. You talked about how the impacts were pretty null so far. What other factors are there that are keeping the economies down in these places? They're pretty depressed to begin with. And related to that, is there any value to taking an integrative design approach to social issues? So rather than saying, we know roads do this, but electricity just does this, what is the impact of the combinations?
Yeah, I think considering these large infrastructure projects together is essential to figuring out the right combination of them that we should be installing. And I think, unleashing the potential of a cell phone network is also going to depend on having the energy infrastructure to power that cell phone network, for example. And so yes, just thinking about one of these things in isolation doesn't cut it. We do really need to think about the full puzzle. In terms of other constraints that are running around in this situation, I think there's a couple of things. So one is credit is really hard to come by. So in our own research, we went and visited some of these villages in Karnataka, in a southern state in India, to try and understand exactly what was going on. And one of the things that we noticed was that these households are really poor. They don't have access to banking. They don't have access to even microcredit in many situations. And so what that means is the grid comes to them, and the only thing that they can afford to buy is a light bulb. Now that's great, they have a better light, but they already had a kerosene lamp before, so they weren't going from darkness into light completely, right? You have something that was probably a worse substitute, but a substitute nonetheless, to now a slightly better version of that technology. But at the same time, the thing that you would really want for these guys to be able to invest in to become actually substantially more productive would be something like an agricultural pump to actually get groundwater out of the ground, or electric sewing machine or something like that. And those types of more capital-intensive technologies, there's just not the credit or even the basic level of capital to actually be able to invest in those types of things. So I think thinking about credit or financing or sort of additional subsidies for just basic levels of income is another important sort of side thing that we should be thinking about with power.
Are you able to look at the impact of adding electricity and the light bulb on education? So something that you're not really going to see a dramatic improvement for several years, But is this one of the things that you're looking at?
Yeah, so two of the studies that I mentioned look at education in some sense. So the study in Kenya that is connecting grid or households to the grid doesn't look at sort of educational attainment years of schooling, but it does look at test scores. That's again in the relatively short run, but they're finding basically zero effect, and it's a pretty tightly estimated zero. We have a slightly different approach. We don't see test scores per se, but we look at years a kid is in school, and we can see number of kids who are in elementary school versus middle school, number of kids or number of boys and girls staying in school, and we find no difference between electrified and unelectrified places in those outcomes. But again, that might be something where, you know, if 20 years later having access to electricity allows you to send a kid to college, then there's a big return to that. It's just really hard to see. The data are noisy, and that kind of impact takes a long time. On the other hand, that means we're trading off 20 years of spending on power for some other kind of investment that might also be beneficial.
So I think we have time for maybe one last question, and then we're going to have our closing remarks and go slake our thirsts and so forth. So Mari.
Yes, no? Okay. Yeah, so I wanted to ask some more about what the grid might do or the microgrid might do to these households, and maybe also ask Fiona about this, but also the rest. So do you know what's the type of microgrid that's in place in these studies, and how much can they connect to it? So you said they got a light bulb. Can they connect much more than a light bulb? And I'm thinking about some of the synergies that Sera was talking about. So could they even cook at home with electric cooking? I'm not sure if even some of those systems would allow that type of appliance level. So it would be interesting to see if there's a curve of development where maybe really small kind of home solar things don't quite do it, but maybe larger scale microgrids start having an impact. But obviously there's still very limited evidence, so I don't know what's the verdict on that.
Yeah, so the microgrid study the first microgrid study in India was basically solar homes and maybe a couple of cell phone chargers, so pretty small scale. The second study is somewhat larger. They're in a context where the obvious substitute is a diesel genset, so maybe you can have a small fridge, that type of thing. I think, you know, the other couple of studies were looking at the grid, and so there we do actually have, in many cases, the capacity to power some of these larger appliances. But I think in terms of scaling microgrid technologies effectively, one thing that's important is thinking about technology that will be compatible not only with growth today, but growth 10 years from now as incomes start to increase. I think one thing that would be unfortunate to see with microgrids is governments deciding that once a microgrid is in place, that's all we need to do in terms of energy infrastructure, especially if those microgrids are limited to these really small capacity connections. We've seen some evidence that demand for appliances skyrockets as incomes go up. You really see this kind of S-shaped demand curve for new appliance adoption with income, and so being able to find energy solutions that support not only current growth, but future growth is going to be really important. And so I think finding microgrids that are able to help bridge between existing income levels and what type of capacity they might be able to get from the grid is going to be an interesting piece of this challenge going forward.
Okay, so what I'm going to ask is for us all to thank the three panelists one last time. And now it's time for closing remarks.
So I really promise I'll keep this very brief. It's mostly, I'd like to take a couple minutes to say some thank yous. I'd like to start by thanking our panelists and our keynote speakers. Some of you traveled a long way to be here today, and we really appreciate the time you took sharing your experience and your perspectives about renewable energy and microgrids and development, which I think allowed us to cover some really interesting terrain. I'd like to thank everyone who attended this workshop today. We covered a lot of material. And especially, I'd like to thank you for posing a lot of interesting questions and facilitating some interesting conversations along the way. A lot of work went into the symposium. We had a lot of support from Northwestern Marketing, from the Northwestern Institute on Complex Systems, and I'd like to particularly thank Justina Gutowska, who, I'm not exaggerating here, without Justina's support along the way, we probably wouldn't have been able to pull this off. Any of you who were part of the program got many emails and such from Justina, so please join me in thanking her for helping make this a success. And lastly, thank you to Stone Edge Farm, and especially Jorge and Craig for the very interesting presentations today. I think hearing about the microgrid at Stone Edge Farm was just a really good reminder that renewable microgrids are not only possible, but they exist today as a potentially very clean, reliable source of energy that, under the right circumstances, could really make a difference towards sustainable development. But it's not going to happen on its own. So we covered quite a bit of interesting topics today, but what struck me was that to realize the potential of renewable microgrids as one potential solution for sustainable development, there's action needed on several fronts. First, we need to intensify our investments in technology innovation. While the technologies exist today, we still need a lot of work on bringing the cost of those technologies down so that microgrids can be more modular, more reliable, and especially lower cost to meet the energy access needs in parts of the world which are particularly capital constrained. We need to intensify our investments in deploying more of these systems, and soon to start addressing the energy access gap. But we need to do so intelligently, knowing that microgrids are only one part of a broad suite of solutions that the world needs. And we need to do so by better understanding what load we're meeting, what energy uses we're providing, how to better match efficiency with the right type of microgrid at the right place and at the right time. There's a lot of investment in research and intelligence gathering, and frankly, trial by doing that needs to happen there. And finally, we need to really raise the level of policy ambitions to not only remove some of the really pervasive regulatory barriers we heard about today, but also to provide a really strong enabling environment to promote more investment and more deployments of renewable microgrids moving forward. So, as I mentioned at the outset, this was Northwestern's very first event exploring the nexus between renewable microgrids and development. And any one of the topics we cover today, we could devote an entire day or even longer to explore in detail. So really, we had two primary goals. The first was we wanted to raise some interesting questions that can hopefully motivate the research community to further tackle some of the technology, policy, data gathering, and economic barriers that might be holding renewable microgrids back. And I hope that you found that together, through our discussions and presentations today, we made some small contributions towards that goal. But second, we really wanted to try to facilitate some new connections among you and among the panelists and keynote speakers, which can hopefully lead to new collaborations moving forward so that we can start to tackle some of these pressing challenges together. And to that end, I want to stop talking and invite you to attend our reception, which is really meant to help carry some of these connections forward. It's time to relax, it's time to reflect, it's hopefully time to reinforce some of these new connections. So we'll be having a reception in the atrium, which will last until roughly, I think, 6 p.m. Please join us there for drinks, and let's continue the conversation. With that, thank you for attending. I hope you enjoyed it.